This story is from around 5 or 6 years ago when I was a teenager, but I could still remember it clearly. For some context, this was a wooded area near my hometown in the UK that had established bike paths, and people visited it regularly, making it a decently known area, but it was still large and had areas that no one would go to. It began when my friend and I cycled into the area to do some jumps and generally just ride around. When we spotted a swing on top of a hill and decided to go up and use it. We did so and spent an hour or two just talking and swinging, and it began to get dark. My friend took off as he had to be back early, and me, instead of leaving, I cycled around a bit longer. I ended up cycling deep into the woods until I was no longer on the bike path, and instead barely visible dirt paths. I went up a pretty steep hill, and that's when it happened. Below me, around 20 meters or so, near the bottom of the hill, stood a man wearing a black leather gas mask, some kind of military-looking jacket, and holding a thick torch in his hand. The torch wasn't on, and he was just crouching down in my direction towards the hill, staring straight at the ground. And from what I could tell, he wasn't doing anything at all. Then he looked up at me. I couldn't make out if he was staring directly towards me, but the cold black voids of the eye mask sockets terrified me. I immediately nearly shit myself and leapt onto my bike. As I heard heavy, rough, fast breathing getting louder and louder, I rode as fast as I could for about 10 seconds before quickly looking back. He stood at the top of the hill, no longer chasing but staring at me with the same cold black eyes. I never told anyone what happened, not even any of my friends. And even now, driving past that place sends a chill down my spine. I know it's not a particularly amazing story, but it definitely still scares me. An hour ago, I was headed to a nearby lake, a place I usually go for my therapy sessions because it's usually pretty serene and peaceful. About 90% of this area can be seen from the busy road. However, there are a few blind spots. So I pulled into my usual parking area and immediately got a weird feeling when I saw another car parked kind of hidden under a tree close by. I'm a female in my 20s, so I'm always on high alert. I made sure to keep my eye on that car when I was getting my stuff together in my car. 1 second I look up and there's no one in the car. Then a couple seconds I look again and a man is suddenly sitting in the car driver's seat staring at me. It was like he came out of nowhere. At this point, I'm pretty wary about going out into the grass by the lake, but I continue to slowly pack up my stuff while I continue to keep an eye on the man in the car. I open my door and the man immediately gets out of his car and stands in front of it. He's doing a weird stretch and still staring at me. This lake is very close to a very popular amusement park, so it's not uncommon for travelers to stop at the lake for rest. So I try to reason in my mind and decide I'll just sit in my car for my therapy appointment. I still had about 15 minutes before it started to get settled. So I get into my back seat, close and lock the doors, but roll down one window because it was hot in the car. I open my laptop and I look over at the man again. He's now opening an almost empty bottle of windshield wiper fluid and starts to pour it into his car as he looks up at me. His whole vibe was sketchy and creepy, and I was debating on leaving. The man then pulls out his phone, does something on it, then continues to fill his washer fluid. All of a sudden, a white van with no windows rolls up and parks right behind me. No one gets out. I immediately climb over the console into the driver's seat and start to pull away. The van was close to my car, but there was enough room for me to back up and pull out of there. A couple seconds after I pulled out, the van follows. The man gets back in his car. I panic, but I'm able to pull onto the road between the two cars, so the van wasn't able to catch up with me. I made sure that no one was following me home as I drove. It might have been a coincidence, but better safe than sorry. I also called the non-emergency line, just in case. and they said that they would send an officer out to patrol the area for a bit. Before starting to tell you what happened and how I got into the situation, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit. I'm 29 years old and live in Switzerland, where I work as a cop. Basically, it's like 911. Someone calls, then dispatch sends us for all kinds of interventions. Sometimes things that you see in that job changes your perspectives on what's normal. You meet all kinds of people, and sometimes weird places too. But in general, my country is safe, and I almost never carry my gun home unless I go to training at a shooting range. Also, because it's linked to my story, I love music and driving cars. It helps me clear my mind and it makes me feel good. Some time ago, I met a club of car enthusiasts, and from time to time we meet and do little road trips across the country. I'm also a very chill and calm person, and I always try to find peaceful solutions to anything, especially at work. I try to always see the good in people and prefer to talk to them. Okay, on to the story. Last year, I went on a road trip with this nice guy I met through the car club. Let's call him Robert. The trip was really cool, and we drove almost all night, which was great because the lights of the city looked beautiful at the time, and I'm more of a night owl. After that trip, we said that we'll stay in touch to make another trip someday. Weeks passed when I suddenly got a message on WhatsApp. Hi, it's been a while. How are you? Still up for a little trip? Tell me when you're free. When I saw the message, I checked my schedule and found a free day. I sent him back, hey, yeah, sure. I'm free on. Let me know what works for you too. He answers, okay, works for me too. Where do you want to hike? Then I was confused. Why is he talking about hiking? I checked the message again and noticed it was written by another Robert. Not only did I mistake the dudes by their names, but they also had a profile picture on WhatsApp that looked alike. The guy that contacted me was an old acquaintance I met through some friends when I did some DJ set parties. It was a few years ago, and we were both passionate about the same music. Then, from time to time, we bumped into each other at concerts. So I just planned a day with this guy that I mistaken for someone else. I felt bad and didn't want to cancel because although I thought I was a different person, the guy was nice too, and it's been a while since I went for a hike in the woods or mountains. So I was like, yeah, why the hell not? Then we started planning the hike. I didn't want something too challenging, so I made a proposition. I knew a nice hike that would go through the woods and mountains. The views are beautiful, and you get to meet hikers here and there. Also, the path has multiple campfire sites where you can grill up some sausage. Robert agreed and asked me if it was okay for me to take him to the train station, and we'll leave my car at the parking next to the woods. The day of the hike, I arrived at the train station where Robert was waiting for me. I looked through the place and couldn't find him. Then he waved at me. I got my first red flag. The guy I knew and saw in the profile picture looked different. It was Robert, but he looked sloppy. He grew his hair long and had a beard. I put his bag in the trunk and we were on our way. During the ride, I noticed Robert smelled bad. It was the kind of odor I'd smell on the job when I'm confronted with homeless people or drug addicts. But I noticed he came well equipped for the hike, which means he wasn't in a bad money situation. So I decided to not judge him because of his body odor and just ignore it. Besides, we'll be in the woods, so outside I wouldn't notice it. We stopped at a shop near the woods to get some fire starter, and that's when Robert asked me if I was up to change the hike because he knew another location close to the one I've chosen that had some nice spots for pictures. We both carried good cameras. I'm good with a map, so I checked it on my special app. The hike was the same length as mine, but it went near the river, which I found really nice. Okay, let's go, I said. Finally, we parked our car and arrived at the forest. I saw some old barns there and a little field for cows. Our little trip started. During the hike, I was questioning Robert on his life to catch up time. I already knew he was a smart guy who did engineering school, but I had learned that he had moved out of our city and found some job at a construction company where he does all kinds of calculus to build stuff. Then, the more I learned about his life, the more I felt something was odd. Robert started telling me about his girlfriend, about how they were going through some hard times, and he thought she might leave him soon. Then he continued saying that he missed some days of work because he felt depressed, because he wasn't sure it pleased him anymore. He said he might get fired. I was trying to cheer him up and kept focusing on the good stuff and advised him to consult if necessary. He asked me about my job and how I react to dangerous people and stuff like that. I wasn't reassured by all this conversation, but I always get those kind of questions from people, so you can't tell if I was shocked or not. Also, during the walk, sometimes he looked a bit off, like robotic. At some point near the river, we found what looked like ruins of an old mill. Had to have been from the 1880s to 1920s, I would say. It was a cool spot, and I took a pic or two. But we didn't see any people on our path, and the sky was cloudy, and it started to rain a bit. Luckily, I was well equipped. I carried everything you need in these kinds of places: water, food, fire starter, first aid, and a knife. We kept moving until we found a campfire spot with a wooden table. We decided to stay there and eat. I asked Robert to get some wood while I set up the table and looked for some branches to maintain the fire. Robert puts his bag on the table and starts to show me the tools he had with him. He grabs a big handsaw and puts it on the table. Then he takes out 2 knives, and one of them a really long one. I was surprised to see that kind of knife because it's a 3-hour hike and we're not staying the night nor hunting something. So I decided to pull the knife out of the holster I had attached to my belt to get some branches. Robert looked at me and then he said something in a surprised tone that froze me to my bones. "Oh, you have a knife too?" Immediately, my mind starts racing. 2? What does that mean? Why wasn't I supposed to get a knife when we planned to go into the woods and make a campfire? Robert suddenly leaves to get what I asked him to get, and I got an uneasy feeling. It's like my whole body was on alert mode, saying something is going on. I'm used to being around dangerous people at the job, but it's different when you're working fully equipped, bulletproof vest, gun, pepper spray, and you're with your partner. In the situation I was right now, we're alone in the woods, and we didn't see anyone else on the path. From that moment, I decided to keep both my eyes on Robert and keep him in my sights at all times, especially his hands. That's what you learn at the police academy. People always use their hands to do the harm. A few minutes later, Robert comes back, puts all the branches he grabbed from the trees, his knife still in his hand. He looks straight at me and just stands there. Suddenly he said, "I'm sorry." His tone felt empty of emotion. Immediately I got up and looked at him. I was sure that he was going to run at me and try something bad. I got a rush of adrenaline. Then he started to mumble something I could barely understand. "We're both here in the woods, alone. We got knives. I'm sorry." What does he mean? Why is he acting so weird? Then Robert continues, "Let's hug." My body gave me even more alerts. Why does he want to get close to me while he's holding a knife in his hand? Is he trying to do something bad? Why would I hug him out of nowhere? Then my mind told me to get out of the situation quickly, but without making him suspicious. I wanted to leave this place and go home. I finally replied, like nothing happened, "No worries, man. Let's make a fire, eat something. Then we could go home before getting completely wet." But I didn't want to get close to Robert. I asked him to get more branches, because once he got me, we're drenched. I took this rain as my opportunity. After he came back, I told him that the fire starter didn't work well in the rain, and it might be a better option to pack our stuff and head back to the parking lot. He first looked skeptical and disappointed, but agreed. We packed everything and left the place. I didn't want to talk to him on the way back, but I didn't want him to notice something was odd, so I just kept talking like nothing happened. From that moment, his tone changed a bit, seemed colder to me. I kept him in my sight. After all, we were alone in the woods. He kept being very negative towards life and people. It made me think that he was suicidal in some way. I was happy I did not carry my gun that day because I was afraid that he might try to do something with it. Once we got into the parking lot where I finally saw people, he asked me if I could give him a ride. I refused, arguing that I just got an urgent call from someone and needed to leave. After that, I kept asking myself, was he trying to do something? Was he just afraid by the situation? Maybe it was odd for him, even though we knew each other and even partied together. Was he planning something? I mean, we were alone in a place he knew better than I did, and he was a really smart guy. All I can tell you is I blocked him, and after that I decided to contact our common friend. I knew he was close to Robert, so I explained the whole situation. My friend told me that Robert was going through depression and was feeling bad lately. I told him I can't do anything legally to help him without his consent, but I advised my friend to call him and make him see someone. A few weeks later, my friend had a discussion with Robert, and apparently Robert was open to see someone about his problems. Let me know what you think about all this. I'm still confused to this day. I'm a 28-year-old female. When I moved up near the Arctic Circle with my husband, 28, I was only 26 and halfway through my first pregnancy. It was just starting to turn from autumn to winter. We were waiting for our house to be move-in ready and had settled into a little hotel with a separate cluster of rooms right next to the forest. I frequently took walks with my dog Storm, usually until I reached a narrow clearing where I walked a bit more before turning around. I was still getting used to how far I could go while pregnant. We had never seen any people, or most importantly, other dogs while on our walks, so Stormy and I could relax while he jumped about in the leaves. One day, though, my husband happened to have work off and wanted to see where I went. He took his new gun with him. We got to the narrow clearing and continued towards where I usually would turn around, but before he got there, Stormy suddenly jumped in front of me and began loudly snarling. If it were an animal, he would have just happily jumped towards it. If it were a dog, he would have stayed clear. And he loves humans, so I was confused. As I stared off to where he was looking, I finally saw the heads peeking at us from behind the trees a couple paces from where we usually would turn around. I lurched forward and wrapped my arms around Stormy's neck, and by the time I turned around to look at my husband, he had already had his gun drawn. With my boy standing their ground, both parties waited to see what the other would do. A few horrifying seconds passed, and I made the first move, insisting we turn back. They were more hesitant, but the last thing I wanted to do was gunshots flying so close to our unborn daughter. They didn't follow us, and we made it back with everyone on edge. We soon moved to a room that opened up closer to our house, and we never saw them again. Not that I could have made out their facial features anyway. Later on, I learned that there were a lot of weird cults in that area. I'm a male. This happened when I was 9. My sister, dad, stepmom, and I were in a place called Palmetto Island. It was a camping resort where you just pull up with a tent or camper and stay there for the weekend or so. We were in a camper. Before I get to the actual story, I should set the scene. Palmetto Island wasn't really an island in the traditional sense. It was completely surrounded by palm trees and vegetation, except for the road in and out. There were roads within the resort, but they were only for golf carts and smaller vehicles. The whole place was also dense with palm trees and vegetation. If you weren't on the road, in a campsite, or at one of the recreation areas, you'd be in the forest. Now for the actual story. My family and I were all hanging out at the playgrounds. I had made a new friend who I was playing with. At some point, the rest of my family had let me play with my new friend, until eventually he left too. I was alone and the sun was beginning to set. It wasn't the first time we've been here, and I had, at the time, known it pretty well. I had assumed that the walk back to our campground would be short. However, at some point, I got turned around and ended up going to an area where you would launch boats into the water for fishing. There was a group of people there, and I asked them for directions. Now, I wasn't completely brain dead, so I lied and said that the number of our campsite was about 10 from our actual campsite. They pointed me in the right direction, and I started walking. Now, I hadn't known at this time, but my family had realized that I was no longer at the playground and started driving around in our golf cart and another one they had rented. If they hadn't, I probably wouldn't be telling this story. As I'm walking towards our campsite, a car pulls up beside me, and one of the people I asked for directions rolls down the window. Keep in mind, I had been walking for about an hour or two in total. He offers me a ride and tells me to ride in the front seat. Me, tired and weary of walking, accepts and gets in the car. I know now that that's something you should never do. We were driving in the right direction until he passes the entrance to the campsites, at which point I know something's wrong. I tell him that he passed it up and he doesn't respond. By some stroke of divine luck, I see my dad in the golf cart driving the opposite direction as us, and I start yelling and waving at him. He pulls in front of the car and stops, and so does the guy driving. I use the manual unlock in the car and run to my dad, who has his concealed carry drawn on the guy. As soon as I'm out of the way, he calls the police and holds the guy at gunpoint until they get there, and they arrest him. I'm only telling this story now because I found out last week that the guy and his whole family had done this before, and they had gotten away with it. I try not to think what would have happened to me if my dad hadn't shown up when he did. Creepy family that tried to kidnap me. Let's not meet. There's a hiking trail close to the school I go to. It's about 2 miles to the top with a beautiful view over the entire valley. My friend and I went up there one Saturday. The sun was about to set right as we started the 2-mile walk down. Terrible timing, but we know the trail. Everything is good. Creepy though because it was getting dark and I'm paranoid to begin with. I'm not really paying attention, but I hear my friend say, "What's that?" I don't have good eyesight, so I look and didn't see anything. "It's a girl," my friend said. I was freaked. It's 9 p.m. on a hiking trail that not a single person is on. As we get closer, I see her sitting on the ground in a pile of leaves, with her knees to her chest. She's rocking back and forth in only a pink nightgown. It's February. My friend and I chalk it up to someone being on a terrible trip in the woods. Feeling bad since it happened to my friend once. We debated asking if she needed help. That was until my friend saw that she was cradling a knife in her lap. Fuck that, I thought. I'm out of here. More freaked, we picked up our pace, but still think the girl could just be tripping. We start joking, saying it must be a terrible trip in the woods at night to try to calm ourselves down. Then we see a man running frantically, asking if we've seen his daughter. The girl was about 20, not a little girl, although she was dressed like one. We say we haven't seen her because we were freaked the fuck out, thinking we just seen a girl who escaped a kidnapper. As you can guess, we ran the entire way. Unfortunately, where we were parked wasn't a single other car to call and give a license plate number. But we did call and report what we saw. They searched, but we never heard an update. I don't know what was happening in those woods. I don't know if I ever want to. 3 years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to hike up near her parents' place in Oregon when we went to visit them for a week. We decided to bring camping gear with us and stay the night. I had only been camping once before, and it was in Boy Scouts, so it had been a long time. My girlfriend grew up camping and knows her way around that area very well. So myself, her parents' dog, Bear, head up the trail. We saw a few people out, mostly day hikers. People loved Bear and would stop to pet him. So a little after 6, we make up camp, set up our tent, and pull out our grub. We had decided to buy big sub sandwiches, stuff for s'mores, chips, and a few tall boys of beer. I fired up a joint and she pulled out her guitar after we finished eating. Great relaxing night, and we started winding down, getting ready to head for bed. She was in the tent getting dressed for bed while I finished the joint and made sure the fire was out. Suddenly, Bear growls this low, menacing growl I've never heard from him before. I pet him, look around, and figure it's just an animal or something. We get to sleep around 1 a.m. I wake to my girlfriend shaking me, and she looks terrified. I hear Bear growling beside us, and she's holding a finger up, talking slow. She tells me that she woke up to voices. I listen to hear what sounds like two men talking. Then we hear something absolutely terrifying. One of them says to their friend, "I'll take the girl. You get rid of the guy." I knew we were screwed. We had no weapons of any sort. My girlfriend unzips the tent, and Bear rockets out. I've never seen him move that fast in my life. I hear one of them yell, "Oh shit!" And then I hear Bear snarling and growling, and I hear them running. My girlfriend takes a satellite phone her dad insisted she carry and calls her dad. He calls law enforcement, and we stay in the tent as instructed. Bear comes back out of breath, no sign of the guys, and we wait for the ranger. When they show up, they find no signs of the guys, save for the truck tire tracks and cigarette butts. They give us a ride back to our car. And later that day, Bear got a steak and plenty of love. So to the guys who wanted to do Lord knows what with me and my girlfriend, let's not meet again. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and tons of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there's some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees. The only employment in the area is Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some are littered with broken glass from what I guess to be car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging around there, or just driving around the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along the roads meant for 4x4s. Some people you see in the car look like that guy that got crushed by the ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. You just have to be careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to play paintball in the national forest. Probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep looking, so we drove for another hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it was getting a bit dark, and we were getting worried about finding a spot. We had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the forest rangers used a backhoe with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. It looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over these mounds, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was the old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down the road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over some plywood tables nailed to a tree, which was kind of odd. That being said, it was pretty much dark at this point, so we didn't want to keep driving all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running, and we set up our tent. As we were setting up our tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I see green bottles laying on the ground. I take a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of Home and Garden insecticide. I was tired at the time, and I just thought someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone was dumping their garbage in that area when we were more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably 11 p.m. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of the nearby hill. At first, we thought it was the moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angle didn't make sense at all. It didn't seem to be a bright light. It was kind of like the glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decided to stay behind and pop some popcorn over the fire. We started walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the areas have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could be the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange for a beaver to go all around the trees like that and just knock off the bark in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about a ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we were almost at the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit." A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided maybe we don't need to see what the light was after all. We walked back in silence and kept looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we get a couple 100 feet from the campsite, I see my friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wear before. For some reason, he was carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, which we said to each other. The fire started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we were probably gone for almost an hour. From that distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He was walking around the site and was peering in the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, We saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet away and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbles. We ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with his paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We check the truck, enter the door code, and we see all our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing when we left? I asked. I was watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with a paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to the house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent. We just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump into the F-150 and start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been laying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, we have sobered up from the situation. No one wants to get out of the car and try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of my F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It must have just been bouncing on top. We drive over it slowly. We're terrified that it will pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a truck following us, with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off of it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service Road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to the house, but I decide to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again though.